All right, so where we left off, we should be on our master branch. Our app should look like this. Just with the header, should be working. Got a couple warnings. It's fine. So what we're going to do next is we're going to pull data from the server like we did before, but we're going to do it, of course, using Redux. And we're going to talk about a couple things we're going to run into. But before we do any of that, I want everybody to follow along with the next few steps we're going to do. First thing, open another terminal tab or another window, however you have to do it, and go to just to your front end folder. So however you got to get another window open to your front end folder, do that. In our front end folder, we should have our old to-do list. So it looks like it was just called to-do app or something along those lines. So I'm going to change directories into our old app. I am going to go. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to open my code editor to this directory. So I'm going to have a second code editor open. And I believe we put everything in a config file. So there's a config folder in our old list, config index, that has your API key in it. Okay. Copy that API key. Everybody with me? All right, now we're going to go back to our current new project, and we're going to go to Actions, Index, and at the top here, we're going to say const base underscore URL equals an empty string, and then const API underscore key equals empty string, and then paste your API key in there. And then for the base URL, we're going to do http://API period React prototypes.com. Okay, everybody got that? Okay, we're going to do one more thing before we get rid of our old project. Okay, so in the terminal with the old version of the to-do app, we're going to say, in all capital letters, we're going to say port equals 5000. If you're in a Windows command line, this probably won't work. So you have to be in Bash, just as a side note. And then npm start. And then you should see the message that starts the dev server on 5,000 instead of 3,000. Okay. Did everybody start okay? All right, now let's go to our browser and go to localhost 5000. And make sure you have items in your to-do list. If you don't have items in your to-do list, add a couple. Because you may need a minute to add a couple items. Okay. Doesn't matter what they are, just as long as you have some data showing up here. So that way when we do it in the other app, you'll be getting data, so you'll know it's working. Everybody good? Cool. So I'm going to close that tab. We're done here. I'm going to go back to my terminal. Make sure you're in the right one. I'm going to stop this server. So Control C. And then I'm going to close that tab. And then make sure you go to the proper code editor of the old to-do list and close that window. Okay. So now all that should be open is the new app stuff.
Close the port 5000
Yes.
terminal?
Yes. Make sure you stop it first and then close it.
What would happen if you didn't?
Huh?
What would happen if you didn't stop it?
It might be okay. If you're on a Mac, it's probably
Oh,
fine.
I get it. That was just that.
On a Mac, it's probably fine. On Windows, it might have kept it running in the background. Everybody all set? Cool. All right. Go back to the terminal, and we're going to create a new branch. I'm going to say get checkout -b. Notice that we made changes, but it's fine. If you check out to a new branch, it takes all your changes with you. So get checkout -b, and we'll say list from server. All right. So first thing we need to do is we need to make a list component so we could display our data. So over in components, we'll make a new file, and I'll say list.js. Okay. Since we're using Redux, we probably don't necessarily need component state, although you can, and at times still should, use component state. Just because you're using Redux doesn't mean you can't use component state anymore. You can use both. You want to keep your state close to where you're going to be using it. Redux is for stuff that's kind of app-wide, stuff that you need to use in multiple places. Multiple things might need access to it. Okay? So usually in a large-scale app, that qualifies for a lot of your data. You're going to want to access across multiple components and stuff like that. But if you have just an isolated component where only it needs some specific data, or it only, maybe it's like a modal and it needs to know if it's open or closed, then you can still use the component state to control that action. Okay? You don't have to run everything through the Redux state. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to go through all that process when you're just using it in that one place. So keep that in mind. It is still okay to use component state. But in this case, we don't need component state, but we are going to need to know when this component mounts, so we know when to call the server to get our data and store it into the Redux state as a result. So let's say import React component React list extends component render return, and we'll do a UL with the class of collection, and inside of that we'll do one li with a class of collection item. This will be the to-do list. And then finally, export it. Export default list. Everybody go with their list? Okay. All good? Cool. Everybody good? All right. So we have our list. So what we want to do now is we want to make sure it works. So we'll throw it inside of our app components. We'll go over to app.js. And we will import list from this directory list. And then we'll put it right below our H1. So you should now see this will be the to-do list and what's going to be our list. Everybody good? Sweet. So now that we know the component works, let's actually do this as a route instead of just as this. So I'm going to import, still in app.js, I'm going to import curly brackets, route from React router DOM. And instead of saying list, I'm going to say route path equals / exact component. No, not capital C. Component equals list. Right? And it should look exactly the same if we check it out. Should pretty much nothing should have changed. So looks the exact same. All we did was set it up with routing. All good? All right. Oh, someone say hold on?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
What's that? Yeah. I'll have two of them. All good? All right. So what we want to do now is we want to get our list data. We want our list data to end up in the Redux state. That means we need to use an action creator to get our data, and then to eventually update the Redux state. So first thing we do whenever we knew we're going to be doing a new type of state update, we know we're going to need some type of action that we probably don't already have. And then we have to make the action creator to dispatch or send that action out. So let's first go to our types file inside of the actions folder. So inside of actions, we'll go to types, and we'll add a new key value pair in here that is get list data. And we'll set that to the string of get list data. All right, so we have a new type. Now we need to use an action creator to dispatch that type, and we'll probably need to send along the data from the server. So we're going to ultimately run into a couple issues. Well, let's walk through them and see what happens. All right, so first thing is, if we're going to make a network request, what do we need? Axios. So I am in the actions folder index file. Okay. I'm going to import Axios from Axios. Remember, action creators are just functions that return an object. That object is considered an action that gets passed to the reducer. Okay? It's important to know those steps. Okay, so action creator returns an object. That's our action. That gets passed directly into our reducer. And then from there, it makes the decision on how to update the state. But what we're concerned about is the action creator returns an action, and it gets passed the reducer. So we'll create a new action creator, get list data. And I've shown you guys async await before. So let's try that and see what happens. So in front of my function, I'm going to say that it's asynchronous. And then I'm going to say const response equals await. And then axios dot get. I'm going to use backticks. I'm going to form my URL. I'm going to say $ curly brackets, our base URL, / totos. And then tack on our API key, $ curly brackets, API key. And then I'm going to return our action. I'm going to say return, say type is equal to types dot get list data, and we'll say we'll give it a payload of whatever the response from the server is. All right, so when we call this, call the server, then return the data, and this will get passed to the reducer. So let's jump over to the reducer and handle that. But I want to make sure everybody's good here first. Everybody good? Okay. So from here, we'll follow the same flow it follows. So this object should get passed to the reducer from here. So let's jump over to the reducer. So in the reducers folder, list reducer should end up here as our action. So we'll do a case for it. We'll say case types dot get list data. And I'm going to do a console.log get data action. And then for now, I'm just going to return state unchanged. Okay? Because I want to see what my action looks like before I do anything with it. Okay? All right. Now, to test all this, to trigger our action here, we have to call our action creator get list data. So inside of list.js, I'm going to first, anytime that you're either updating the Redux state, like we're trying to do now, or pull data from the Redux state, we need connect. Connect is what connects you into the Redux state, gives you access to do different things. So we need to import curly brackets connect from React Redux. And then we need to import our action creator, which is get list data from backend directory actions. And then down at the bottom, I'm going to remove list. I'm going to say connect. I'm going to call connect. Anybody remember how many arguments connect gets?
2.
2. And the first one is what? Map state to props. That's how we get access to the Redux state. That's how we pull data from the Redux state. Do we have a map state to props right now? No. I mean, you'd see it right there if we did. So we don't have a map state to props, so we're just going to say null for right now. And then the second one is our action creators in an object. So we're going to do an object. I'm going to break that up on multiple lines, and I'm going to say get list data is equal to get, nope, wrong get list data. And then after the connect call, so print, open parenthesis, close parenthesis, connect is going to return a function, and I want to immediately call that function that's returned, and I want to pass that our component. So in this case, list. All right, so that should plug our get list data action creator into Redux. So now we can call it from our props and our component, and it should go through the Redux cycle properly. So up at the top of our list component, I'm going to do a component did mount, because that's when we want to call the server. That's whenever this component mounts, we want to get the data. So here I'll say this dot props dot get list data. It's a function I want to call it. So we're going to run into an interesting problem. Okay, so we have this error. Actions must be plain objects. Use custom middleware for async actions. So what the hell is happening here? The problem is two things. Everybody got this error? Everybody with me? So if we go back to our actions index and look at our action creator get list data, whenever you put the async keyword in front of a function, that function now automatically returns a promise. Okay? Now, the problem is we've plugged this function into the Redux cycle using connect. Okay? That code runs all the way through. It doesn't stop. And what it does is it calls this, takes the return value from there, passes it to our reducer. There's no stopping it. It doesn't actually stop at this await or anything like that. Await doesn't stop your code. It looks like it stops your code. It looks like that's what's doing, but that's not what it's really doing. Code stops for nobody. Your code always runs to the end. Okay? So it's going to run to the end of this function, and it's going to not hit here, though, because this return is actually going to wait till we get the response here. But this function still has to complete. Even though this isn't done yet, the function still has to complete. So it's still returning something, even if it's undefined. You know, in the console, when you do console.log, it'll say undefined. Because the console.log is not returning anything, but it still has to return something. All functions always return something. When it hits the end of the function, something is returned, even if that something is undefined. Okay? So that instantly happens. It tries to pass that into our reducer. Redux notices that it doesn't have a type property, that it's not an actual object. It is actually what's happening here. It's like, hey, this isn't an object. You're screwing up the Redux cycle. I can't do anything for you, and it throws that error. Okay? So there is no plain way inside of Redux to make an asynchronous call inside of an action creator. Okay? You can't do it without middleware. You have to have some type of middleware to intercept what is returned from this function and handle it. Okay? And it's this you run into the same, if you're really clever, you might think, well, hey, why don't we just make the call inside of the reducer instead? So how about we just come over here and make the call, when we know it's this case, we can make the asynchronous call here. Same exact problem. Because whatever this function instantly returns, that becomes your new state. So you can't hold off on a function returning somewhere when it's already plugged into other code that's depending on it. Okay, the code's going to run straight through. It's not stopping for anybody. So this is where middleware comes into play. And this is one of the most common uses for middleware in Redux. And what middleware does, we're going to talk more in depth about middleware on Friday. So we're not going to go too deep into it right now. But on a very high level, what middleware does is every action that is dispatched, so every action that is returned from an action creator, every action that is sent out right before it hits the reducers, it goes through middleware. Middleware is just like another function. It's a way to intercept every single action that is running through the app. And you could have your middleware do specific things. Like, for instance, what we needed to do is check to see if it's a promise. If it's a promise, resolve that promise and then send the data through. Not to just pass the promise through. We wanted to, hey, wait, this is a promise. I'm going to hold on to this. Okay, I got my data. Now I'm going to send the action through to the reducer now that I actually have the data. We're going to talk about that in more detail on, I'm pretty sure it's Friday. If not Friday, it'll be early next week. And we're actually going to build the middleware we're about to npm install. Right now, we're just going to npm install it, but we're going to actually build it ourselves when we talk about middleware. So, one more time. The problem is this returns a promise. The promise cannot be passed into the reducer because the reducer can't do anything with it. The promise is not a proper action, so Redux throws an error. So we need to be able to intercept that promise that is returned from this action creator, wait till it's resolved, and then send the action to the reducer. And if you don't know, this error doesn't make any sense, but once you do know, this error actually tells you everything you need to know. Actions must be plain objects, so it's telling us that the action we tried to send to the reducer is not a plain object. It's not a regular object. And it tells us use custom middleware for async actions. So it's already assuming we're trying to do something asynchronously. So once again, that's a bunch of gibberish if you don't understand Redux. But down the road, you're still going to run into this error. You're going to forget to do middleware, or your middleware will not work in the right way. And you'll see this error again. I could almost guarantee it. So once you do understand it better, this error is very, very useful. It's saying your action isn't what it expects it to be. I don't know what to do here. I'm just going to crash everything. So we're going to jump back over to our terminal really quick. Make sure you're in your Redux to-do list folder. And we're going to do npm install --save redux -promise. Redux promise is probably one of the simplest middlewares to use, but you get what you pay for. Okay? There's definitely some downsides to Redux promise, but for what we're doing right now, Redux promise is perfect. And then, so npm install --save redux -promise. So it's a pretty small library. So we're actually going to rebuild Redux promise when we talk about middleware. And we're going to build one other very popular middleware called Thunk. Thunk's a little bit better, still for handling promises, but it gives you a little bit more control over handling the promises. All right, if you're just still installing, that's fine. Just make sure everybody started at the install at least, right? Everyone's good? Everyone's going? All right, we're going to jump over to our very main index file, the index file that is a direct child of the src folder. So this file where we set up our Redux and our router and everything. And we're going to import Redux promise. So somewhere up in your imports, we're going to add import Redux promise from Redux dash promise. Import Redux promise from Redux promise. And then up here where we imported create store, we're going to add another import onto this. Okay. Whenever you're using middleware, you need another little helper function called apply middleware. Middleware is one word. Don't capitalize W. One of my favorite things to do. So apply middleware. So we should now have our apply middleware here with where we imported create store and then Redux promise somewhere. It doesn't matter where you imported it. And then we're going to update our create store. We're going to add some extra arguments. So the first argument is always going to be your root reducer. So your reducers are always first. Second argument is any default state. We're just going to pass it an empty object. And thirdly is your middleware. So we're going to say apply middleware. Apply middleware is a function. We're going to call that function, and then we're going to pass it any middleware we want to add on to it. In this case, we just want to pass it Redux promise. Okay, so to create store, we have a second argument, which is default state. In this case, just an empty object. And then the third argument is apply middleware. And we're going to pass it Redux promise. Once again, we're going to dive deeper and talk more about middleware in the very near future. So, everybody got that set up? Let's do a quick check to see, make sure we're still hitting the same error at the same place. It's actually doing stuff now. Yeah, that's funny. It actually works that way. How funny. Oh no, that we did set it up right. I lied. Never mind. So the one really good thing about Redux promise is A, it just works. And B, if we go back over to our actions index, we actually don't even need to do this part of it. We don't need to make this async. We don't need to await here. We just set whatever our promise is. So remember, axios.get returns a promise. So we take our promise, put it on payload. Redux promise will handle the rest from there. It's like magic. So if we save those changes, we see our console log from our reducer, and then our payload has our server response on it. So payload, and then our data property, and then there's to-dos, and there's all of our to-do items. Okay, so Redux promise is like magic. And it's actually pretty simple to recreate. One thing that's weird about writing your own middleware is kind of the initial setup code for middleware is a little bizarre. But beyond that, middleware is pretty easy to write. Everybody get their list data in the console? Cool. So what we want to do is we want to take this array right here that's inside of to-dos. So action.payload.data.to-dos is our array of to-do items. And we want to update our Redux state with that array. So if we go back over to our list reducer, instead of just returning state, we'll do return a new object, and it will deconstruct the existing state, so we don't rewrite anything else that's in there. And we'll say all is equal to action.payload.data.todos. And I'm going to delete that console log. Okay, so thanks to Redux promise, we don't have to worry about any promises. It's just like, boom, it's there. Can anybody see a downside to that? Error handling. It makes error handling a little difficult. There's ways you can do error handling with Redux promise, but it's kind of a song and a dance. Which is why most people use Redux Thunk, which kind of allows you to handle the promises on your own. And when we talk more about middleware, we'll talk about Redux Thunk. But for now, we're doing it the simple way. We're not really worried about errors. We're just like, hey, Redux promise, do stuff for us. Yay. All right, so save that. Go over to our app. Yes.
Oh, just stretching.
Okay. Yes. Are you just stretching as well? Cannot read property data of
Little splatter.
Go back. All right, so our Redux state should now have our list data in it after the component loads. Just make the call to server, show our list data in it. I want to try something really quick because it looks like they've improved Redux promise. Don't follow me on this. I just want to check it really quick. Oh, yeah, it doesn't work. So you do still have to call it payload. Okay, that's one thing about using Redux promise is you have to put the promise on the payload. Which is fine. All right, so back to where we were at. I just wanted to experiment with that really quick to see if they fixed it so you could do any property. Because you could technically loop through the thing to check any of them if there's a promise and then make sure you put it back on the same one. But lazy. All right, So we should have our list data. So what we want to do is we want to pull that list data from the Redux state and display it here. So if we want to pull the data from the Redux state, what do we need? Yes. Map state to props. Anytime you want to pull data to use, map state to props is always the answer. So inside of our list component, right before our export, we'll say function map state to props mstp. I forgot to capitalize my T. That will get the state passed to it. And then whatever we return from here will get added to our component's props. So we could say list. And to get to our list, it'll be state.list.all. And then we're going to replace null with our map state to props. And then inside of render, I'm going to say console.log list props list.props. All right, if everything worked, what we should see is our list data and our props. So you see our props showed up twice because there's the initial render where our list array is 0. So before we had any data, we made the request to the server, got some data back, our Redux state updated, that data was being pulled into our component, therefore our props changed, causing our component to re-render. So render method got called a second time, and when it got called that second time, it has an array with some amount of to-do items in it. Your amount is going to be different than mine because you have your own API key. Unless you're using my API key, then it'll be the same. But if you're using your API key, it'll be some number of list items. Everybody got their list items and their props? Yes. This dot props. Yeah. Just from saying same list too many times. All right, so now we can map over that array, our list, and make LIs out of it. So if we look at our list, it's an array of objects that have underscore ID, whether it's complete or not, and a title. So we could use some deconstruction. We could say const, curly brackets, list equals list dot props. And then we say const list elements equals list dot props dot map. Say item. And return li with the class name of collection dash item. And then inside of the li, we could do curly brackets and say item dot title. And then List.map. I don't know why I put props in there. No idea where that came from. Thank you. Just list.map, guys. I threw an extra props in there just to mess with you guys. I figured it wasn't confusing enough. Wanted to spice it up a little. All right, and then because we're making an array of JSX elements, we always have to put a key on those elements. So we'll say key equals curly brackets, and we'll say item dot underscore ID. And then finally, last step, we'll delete this li we put in there. We'll say curly brackets, list elements. And if all went well, you should see your list. If anybody needs any help, let me know. Did you read the class? Collection. There you go. Which about? Very good. There's our list. We're seeing a lot of lists. It's looking good. There you go. Use Redux to build a map. Nowhere as crazy as it feels right now. All right. So let's go ahead and take a break. Come back in about 50 minutes. When we come back, we will add an item and we will use Redux form to add that item. Okay. So this video will continue in part 3.